After last month's focus on making minimal 70th style drums, I thought a reasonable follow-up was making some vintagey synths to go along with them. A lot of 60s and 70s synths, like the early Moog synths, used what's called subtractive synthesis, which basically means taking an oscillator source and filtering it to get the desired sound out. I'm not one to divide sounds into leads, pads, bass sounds, etc. I feel that can kind of get arbitrary and prescriptive. So, instead, I'm going to design a synth pack each Sunday, oriented around a particular color. Arbitrary, but a fun arbitrary, don't you think? So when I think of cyan, I think of the cold, ice, and kind of glassy sounds. Something kind of spacey even. So for an oscillator, my instinct is to go with something that's a little bit less bright and in your face, like a saw wave. And instead go with a sine wave. It's real basic and tonal, but because of that, there's not much you can do with a single sine wave in terms of filtering frequencies out, like you would some of the others we'll try out later. But they're definitely still fun to play around with. So I'll just tie this sine on over to an amplitude envelope, or ADSR. Last time I kind of glossed over this thing, but basically ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Attack is the time it takes for a sound to ramp up to a certain volume. Decay is how quickly that sound's volume decays after that point. Sustain is what volume is sustained as you hold the key. And release is how long the sound goes on after the key is released. So for this, we definitely want a long decay and release, and maybe a little attack and sustain too. Something extra I'd like to throw onto the synth is an LFO, or low frequency oscillator, on the pitch. Basically, that'll just oscillate the pitch so we get a little wobbly vibrato effect. Maybe we'll even throw an LFO onto the volume and we can get a bit of a tremolo effect. And finally, because I like these sounds to have a little stereo information so they sound wider, I'll just throw on a stereo flanger. All a flanger does is it takes an audio source, like our sine here, and plays a copy of it on top of our original sound source, just with a slightly varying delay to it. A stereo flanger does the same, it just applies separate flanges to the left channel and the right channels. That means the left and the right side sounds slightly out of phase, which our brain interprets as a wider sound. There's our cyan synth. Magenta's kind of a funky color, not quite warm or cool, and sort of abrasive, which makes me think we should bring back that saw wave from before. Again, a little abrasive, but this and square waves form the bread and butter of chiptune and a lot of electronica sounds actually. So for our purposes, I think we'll use a similar ADSR configuration to what we used on the cyan synth, with maybe a little bit less release. Now we'll play around with filtering. Do you guys remember the last episode with EQing the snare?
And now I'll just EQ it a bit, so that way we can really emphasize the mid-high frequencies, while also cutting out the super high-end and muddy frequencies in the low mids.
Well, that was actually an example of filtering. It was just using a couple of filters in conjunction with one another to get what we wanted. With this synth, I want to play around with a low-pass filter, which is exactly what it sounds like. It lets the low sounds pass through, and the sounds above a certain cutoff frequency get, well, cut off. There's also this knob on most filter controls called resonance, which controls the shape of the filter. A low resonance on a low-pass filter will look like this. Meanwhile, a high resonance will create a peak around the cutoff frequency. The higher the resonance, the higher the peak, which will amplify the frequencies around that region. And you can actually put an ADSR or even LFO controls on the filter frequency as well, which gets you a lot more control on the sound's personality. Here I've put an ADSR with a bit of a longer attack and a bit of resonance to the filter cutoff, which really gets you this wah sound that's a lot of fun to play around with. Finally, I'll also throw on the same stereo flanger that we used last time. Real excited to use this one. I chose yellow for this week. I want to try using a square wave this time, just for more variety of sound, and it also gives me the chance to talk about pulse width. Square waves you can kind of think of as binary. They have two states that they're comprised of, a high and a low. The pulse width of a square wave is just how long the high is in comparison to the whole length of one oscillation. 50% pulse width means that the high is 50% of the total length of the oscillation, and that sounds like this. Meanwhile, something like 25% pulse width would sound like this. For our purposes here, I think 50% pulse width would work though. And as for the ADSR, I want to go for something plucky this time. A lot of our earlier sounds were very long and drawn out, so something a little shorter to contrast against the rest should be interesting. Then I want to mirror that same amplitude envelope onto a low-pass filter envelope, building that kind of plucky sound we're going for. And finally, I'll add just a little LFO onto the pitch, just like we did for cyan. Next Sunday, we put all these sounds together. Let's put all of these colors together. I usually like to start with drums, just to lock us into a groove. I think of it as sort of the lines of an artwork, gives it structure. We'll use last month's drum pack as a base, and with maybe a few alterations or extra sounds here and there, really want to focus on the old school feel with the textures we got so far. And now that we've got a basic groove set up, I want to try and come up with some chords using our magenta synth. Everything we make now is just kind of a base, of course, and we can add some more harmonic complexity and fun chords later if we wanted to make this a full song. So that's just a little chord progression to start us off, and next we can use the yellow synth as bass synth. I always try to do a little more than just playing root notes, especially for funky sounds like this. And next we can throw the cyan synth as a nice melody on top of everything. And that's basically it for the basics. After you play around with subtractive synthesis for a bit, and you start to really understand how certain oscillators sound, it becomes a lot more natural to make the sounds you really want to make. And there's so much more potential for subtractive synthesis, so expect to see it as a regular thing on the show. I'm really interested in seeing what all of you make, so be sure to use the hashtag on Twitter. Leave any suggestions for any topics you'd like me to cover next time in the comment section below. See you next time!